I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. For years, we've heard that the secret to weight control is balancing calories in to calories out. Why isn't it that simple? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
The dogma in nutrition science has long been that all calories are created equal. Recent research has shown, however, that this belief may be wrong. Dr. David Ludwig led a study that looked carefully at the metabolic effects of carbohydrates.
100 calories of sugar and 100 calories of almonds don't do the same thing to our bodies.
We'll find out more about Dr. Ludwig's research and how should the results affect our food choices.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, how a low-carb diet could help with weight control.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, older people who'd like to stay sharp can take one simple step: keep moving. Research from Rush University Medical Center examined 454 older individuals for as long as 20 years. The volunteers took cognitive tests and had physical exams every year. They also agreed to donate their brains for examination upon their deaths. Each participant also wore an accelerometer for 7 days during the study. This is a device worn like a wristwatch that measures movements, including small actions such as walking from one room to another, or larger actions such as a vigorous exercise routine. Some of the study subjects had dementia while the others did not. The accelerometer picked up differences between these two groups. Those with dementia made an average of 130,000 movements daily, as counted by the accelerometer. That may sound like a lot, but the people who were in better cognitive shape had an average of 180,000 movements daily. People with better motor skills also scored better on measures of memory and thinking. Those who moved more during the day were more likely to be thinking clearly and remembering things better. Physical activity and motor skills accounted for 8% of the differences in cognitive test scores.
For years, doctors have used beta-amyloid plaques and tau tangles in the brain as a way of identifying dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. Now scientists at the University of Southern California say they found an independent marker that may show up much earlier in the development of dementia. 161 people over 45 years old took part in the 5-year study. All of them completed cognitive tests that resulted in a score of 0, that's normal, to 3, severe dementia. The scientists also analyzed cerebrospinal fluid for markers of brain capillary permeability. In addition, the volunteers submitted to contrast-enhanced MRIs. The researchers report a strong correlation between breakdown of the blood-brain barrier and poor performance on cognitive tests. Further research may refine the measure of capillary leaking as an early signal of possible dementia. Whether it's possible to reverse capillary permeability and delay or prevent the onset of dementia remains to be seen.
Dermatologists prescribe proportionally more antibiotics than other medical specialties. Frequently, they prescribe antibiotics to treat non-infectious conditions such as acne or rosacea. Frequent antibiotic use can lead to bacteria developing resistance, so the news from a new study in JAMA Dermatology is encouraging. Between 2008 and 2016, dermatologists prescribed fewer antibiotics overall, dropping from 3 to 2 prescriptions per 100 visits. Antibiotic prescriptions rose, however, for surgical procedures and cysts.
A study of 19 million patients suggests that other specialists in the U.S. may be prescribing antibiotics too often. The scientists reviewed antibiotic prescriptions from an insurance database and examined the diagnostic codes associated with them. About 3/4 of the patients covered by the study were adults. The remaining records belonged to children. Nearly 1/4 of the antibiotics had been prescribed for common colds or coughs and were therefore inappropriate. Another third might be appropriate, but also might not be because they were for problems like sore throats or sinusitis, which frequently are caused by viral rather than bacterial infections.
This is the time of year when lots of people have nagging coughs. Traditional cough medicine leaves a lot to be desired. Now, scientists in Great Britain say chocolate could be a good substitute. They conducted a randomized controlled trial comparing a codeine-containing cough syrup to a chocolate-based cough medicine. This Rococo study included 163 patients. People getting chocolate got relief from the coughs within 2 days. That was faster than those taking codeine. The trial medicine containing chocolate compounds is sold in Great Britain under the name Unicough. One of the authors suggests that sucking on a piece of chocolate might be a tasty and effective way to calm a cough. This isn't the first time chocolate has been studied as a cough suppressant. A previous study found that theobromine, a crucial component of chocolate, is an effective cough treatment. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Everyone agrees that obesity is one of the world's most pressing health problems. Overweight contributes to type 2 diabetes, heart disease, joint problems, and a host of other serious medical conditions. But there is little agreement about the best strategies to control weight. Some experts emphasize cutting calories. Others insist that exercise is key. When it comes to diet, there are proponents of both low-fat and low-carb approaches. Clinical trials to test these approaches are uncommon. Today, we're talking about one of the largest and best-controlled clinical trials on diet and metabolism.
Our guest is one of the principal investigators. Dr. David Ludwig is co-director of the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center at Boston Children's Hospital. He's also a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and a professor of nutrition at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig has written 3 books for the public: Ending the Food Fight, Always Hungry, and the cookbook Always Delicious.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. David Ludwig.
Great to be with you, Joe and Terry.
Dr. Ludwig, we've been talking about these issues for not just weeks, months, years, decades, about, dieting and about weight loss. And it seems that this entrenched belief that all calories are created equal is really hard to change. It's foundational. And the idea that you should just eat less and exercise more and the problem is solved has just not gone away. You have conducted, as part of a team, a fascinating study. I believe it was published in the BMJ, and it has created a firestorm of controversy, not surprisingly. But the data is just really interesting, exciting, quite intriguing. Can you tell us what you did, how you did it, and what you discovered?
Sure. Well, the notion that a calorie is a fact of science in physics, but humans aren't toaster ovens. We are dynamic biological systems, so that when you increase calories or, specific to obesity treatment, try to cut back on calories, the body fights back in predictable ways. We get hungrier. That's an experience that most dieters have long before their weight loss goal is within sight. But even if you could ignore your hunger, which is a challenge for many people just going one day, but even if you could ignore your hunger for months or years, the body fights back in other ways, most specifically by slowing down metabolism. And that combination of hunger and slowing metabolism is a recipe for weight gain, and explains why so few people can keep the weight off over the long term. The success of long-term obesity treatment is really less than 10%. But it raises a question, why is the average body weight, why is the weight that our bodies seem to want to defend going up year after year? Why does the average man today say 5'9", weigh 35 pounds more than he would have in the 1950s or the 1960s.
That is a good question. Why?
That's what our study is aiming to explore. According to another way of thinking about it called the carbohydrate insulin model, the influx of processed carbohydrates into our diet during the low-fat years, the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, has raised insulin levels. Now, insulin is an extremely potent hormone. I call it the miracle grow for your fat cells, just not the sort of miracle you want happening in your body. Insulin promotes fat storage, and it prevents calories from being released from fat cells. So, for example, in states of excess insulin action, so someone with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, put on insulin, weight gain predictably occurs. And the opposite also happens. Without enough insulin, it's impossible to gain weight. A child with new onset type 1 diabetes, that's the kind of diabetes where the body can't produce enough insulin because of an autoimmune attack. These children, when they first come to attention, might be consuming 3, 5, or 7,000 calories a day, and despite that, they still lose weight. Put the child on the right amount of insulin, and weight returns to its normal trajectory. Give that child too much insulin, and he or she will gain too much weight. So the question is, could these processed carbohydrates, the white bread, white rice, prepared breakfast cereals, potato products, cookies, crackers, low-fat dressings, could those foods that were actually advertised as healthful during the low-fat years be raising insulin levels and driving weight gain for metabolic reasons? Not because people lack willpower, but simply because their body is being programmed to store too many calories, and attempts to cut back calories are doomed to failure. So that's what our study aims to examine.
Well, it's really innovative research, and because there haven't been that many studies that are that well controlled. So please describe the methodology.
Sure. Well, one of the big controversies about this hypothesis, which frankly isn't new, it's got its origins back 100 years, called the carbohydrate insulin model. One of the big criticisms is that the studies that exist today, the feeding studies, where you give people prepared foods under a highly controlled condition so you can make rigorous assessments of metabolism, that these studies have mostly been negative. They don't show an advantage to low carb or low fat particularly. But the big issue with these studies is that they're hard to do, they're expensive, and almost all the studies available today are extremely short term, typically less than 1 week. And there are only a couple that are as long as 4 weeks. So what's the issue with these short-term studies? Well, we know that the process of adapting to a low-carbohydrate diet isn't immediate. In fact, there's a popular name for it. It's called the keto flu, or the ketogenic flu. When you cut back carbohydrates, it takes the body a while to adapt to using fat, and in more extreme cases of low-carbohydrate diets, using ketones. And that process is predictable. It takes 2 or 3 weeks. So we need studies of at least 1 month to understand how these different diets will affect our metabolism and the likelihood of maintaining weight loss over the long term. That was the purpose of our study. We didn't design it for just a few days or a few weeks. The study looked at low, medium, and high carbohydrate diets over 5 months. So that's plenty of time to see what happens after the body adapts. And we used a large number of participants, 164, which compares with typical studies that might have a dozen or so. So we had enough power and duration to ask this question with precision. And fortunately, we received a large philanthropic grant, much larger than a typical National Institutes of Health grant, which is oftentimes capped at $500,000 a year. One can't do this kind of a study at $500,000 a year. Our study was $12 million from philanthropy. And so here's what we did. We took our participants, 164, after they had lost 12% weight loss, we cut back their calories to bring their weight down by typically 20 to 25 pounds. So what's going to happen to them? Well, we know that they're going to be hungry. Their metabolism will be slowing down. Their body will be fighting back against that weight loss and primed to begin to regain weight. Then we randomly assign them to these three different diets, 20%, 40%, or 60% carbohydrate. And those diets had the opposite gradient of fat, so 60, 40, and 20% fat. We kept protein the same, 20%, that's the rest of the calories, among all three diets, so as not to have any confounding factors. So after the weight loss, we randomly assigned people to these three diets. And we did one more thing. We adjusted their calories to keep their weight constant for the next 5 months. We know that changes of body weight will greatly affect metabolism. We wanted to factor that out. So the question we're asking is, does the ratio of carbohydrate to fat in the diet affect metabolism, and specifically the number of calories we're burning at the same body weight? We used a technique called doubly labeled water. That's stable isotopes. It's considered the gold standard for measuring metabolism among people who are freely moving about, living their regular lives. That's the most relevant question we want to ask. And so what we found was that metabolism sped up on the low-carbohydrate diet by about 200 to 250 calories a day compared to the high-carbohydrate diet. And that difference persisted throughout the 5 months of our study. Now, if that difference remained over the long term, it would spontaneously lead to about a 20-pound weight advantage, weight loss, without any changes in how much food was being eaten. If a low-carb diet also produced more satiety, greater sense of fullness, less hunger, then it could potentially lead to an even greater weight loss over the long term. So these findings suggest that the type of calories you consume affect the number of calories you burn, and that a focus on reducing carbohydrate rather than calories may be more effective for long-term weight control.
You're listening to Dr. David Ludwig. He's a pediatric endocrinologist and a professor of nutrition at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig is professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and director of the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center. His books include Ending the Food Fight, Always Hungry, and the cookbook Always Delicious.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll find out how attitudes towards dietary fat are changing.
Will we eventually be able to end the diet wars and come to consensus about what people should eat to stay healthy?
Why do people get so emotional, go crazy over dietary choices?
Has the study that Dr. Ludwig and his colleagues published in the BMJ changed how they think about diet, especially about fat?
How can we put the study's findings to use in real life and lose those extra pounds?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. Kaya Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's Kaya Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. If you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 1149. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or you can place the order online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the podcast from iTunes.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from certified organic ingredients. That's Kaya Biotics.com.
Today, we're tackling the diet wars. Why are people so emotional about their dietary choices? For decades, many dietary prohibitions were based on assumptions and beliefs rather than scientific evidence. Even when studies were done that showed eggs don't increase the risk for heart disease, for example, many people simply didn't believe it. It's difficult to do well-controlled clinical trials in nutrition, so we're pleased to be discussing one of the largest and most carefully executed such studies today.
We're talking with Dr. David Ludwig. He is co-director of the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center at Boston Children's Hospital. He's also a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and a professor of nutrition at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig has written 3 books for the public: Ending the Food Fight, Always Hungry, and the cookbook, Always Delicious.
Dr. Ludwig, you have just written an important essay in Science, which is the leading science journal here in the United States, and it is titled Dietary Fat, From Foe to Friend. Most people think that if they want to lose weight or maintain weight, they need to be very cautious about avoiding sources of fat. Your recent research that you have just described to us suggests that's not the case. How can people change their attitude about dietary fat?
Well, the purpose of this review article in Science was to put together a perspective based on dialogue among friendly rivals. And so, in fact, our title had a question mark at the end: Dietary Fat, From Foe to Friend. So often with these kinds of articles, a scientist will team up with like-minded individuals to write one perspective. And then the opposite happens from the other side of the debate. And what do we make of this? There can be very little progress with polarization. So our goal was to put together a collaboration that represented the whole spectrum of opinion, from people who were predisposed to preferring low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets to the opposite, people who had been advocating low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets, and someone else who was really focused on just the quality of the foods. And what we aimed to do was decide, well, what do we agree on? What do the facts show? What do we disagree on? And then just be explicit about that. And then craft a plan for resolving these ongoing controversies with new research. So I think that we, in this paper, provide a roadmap for how we can begin to get out of the diet wars that have so polarized the nutrition community, especially around obesity.
Well, yeah, I guess that's what fascinates me the most, because the diet wars and the diet dictocrats are so adamant that their thinking is the only right way to think. And those other guys, whatever it may be, they're wrong. So there's a tremendous emotional content. And that translates to the public at large. Because when we talk about, fat issues, how fat may not be our foe and might even be our friend, we get inundated by messages from people who go, well, haven't you read this book or that book, and don't you know about this study? Hey, you guys are just totally wrong, and you're misleading the public. I noticed that one of your co-authors is Dr. Walter Willett, who is a frequent guest on the People's Pharmacy, arguably one of the leading nutrition experts in the world and one of the most knowledgeable epidemiologists in the world. And he's certainly come around when it comes to the fat issue. So why do you think it's such an emotional target for criticism?
Well, just to complete our author list, we had Jeff Volek, who has been preeminent among the low-carb ketogenic research area, and Marianne Newhouser, who's for many years advocated the advantages of a low-fat diet. Look, the hallmark, the heart and soul of science is controversy and debate. If there were no controversy, why bother doing any research to begin with? We would have all the answers. In many fields in science, things get too personal. Scientists have egos, and sometimes we tend to argue in ways that promote unnecessary polarization. And things, of course, get much worse when you come to social media, where with whatever it is, 280 characters, you may come up with a beautiful quip that puts your opponent into his place, you think, but it's not really. It's just adding more heat, not light. So we really need to reestablish a tradition of respectful dialogue. In my belief, the pendulum had swung much too far toward demonizing all fats during the 80s and 90s. I think that we all agree in this paper that was a mistake, that to say that all fats were bad and all carbohydrates were good. I think all of us agree with that. So I like to see the pendulum swing in the other direction. But as to whether some people would do best on relatively low-fat diets, other people might do best on relatively high-fat diets, how to identify them, what about heart disease, what about cancer? There are many unresolved controversies. We have an epidemic of diet-related disease sweeping the country, sweeping the world. We need to work together. Nobody has all of the answers. And to be demonizing and disrespecting our opponent, I think, strikes at the very fabric of the scientific process.
Dr. Ludwig, you said that you and your co-authors were looking for what you could agree upon. And you've just mentioned that you all agreed that the anti-fat dogma during the 90s was too extreme. What else did you agree on?
Well, we have a table in this paper. I won't go through it specifically, but we have points of consensus, and there are 7 of them. And we think that the quality of the carbohydrates and the quality of the fats are key. That's actually our first point. We agree that saturated fats, at least for the general public who are also eating a lot of carbohydrate, are going to raise cardiovascular disease risk. Now, this is a hotly contended topic. And it's not saying that we're not saying that saturated fat is public health enemy number one. That was a mistake that was made in the 70s and 80s and justified removing saturated fat and replacing it with sugar and starch. But we're saying compared to unsaturated fats, for the general public, too much saturated fat will raise cardiovascular disease risk. But we leave open the possibility that if you're eating a low carbohydrate diet, which will necessarily have a lot of saturated fat, that in that state, saturated fat may not be an issue. Why would that be? We didn't go into this much in the paper, but the idea is that when you're not eating a lot of carbohydrate, the saturated fat that you consume is rapidly burned. It's rapidly oxidized, metabolized. And so it doesn't stick around as long for your body to cause problems. The amount of saturated fat you eat on a low-carbohydrate diet doesn't reflect how much saturated fat is in your bloodstream.
Dr. Ludwig, I wonder how your study in BMJ has changed the thinking of some of your colleagues, and even perhaps some people who have been critical of your research. I mean, it is revolutionary, and I wonder if it's starting to change the thinking that not all calories are created equal.
Our study in BMJ is among the largest and longest and I think most rigorously conducted to address this specific question. But it's also just one study. First of all, we need replication. One study can never answer all questions on a major topic like metabolism and obesity. So the study needs to be replicated. We need to see how it can be applied. These principles can be applied in a real-world setting. Ours was a feeding study where we prepared all of the foods that people consumed for basically a full academic year. Actually, we made a total of 160,000 meals during the course of the study. But of course, people will ultimately have to be able to make their own meals and put these principles into effect in a real-life setting. We're optimistic in that regard, in that people were able to follow these diets, and they were made from normal, everyday foods. But that needs to be examined, and then we need more research about mechanisms. So we don't claim that this is the last word, but we do hope that this study makes a more credible case for a principle that we actually all many of us intuitively know. 100 calories of sugar and 100 calories of almonds don't do the same thing to our bodies.
Right. 100 calories of almonds actually are a lot more filling presumably because of the fiber. I don't know if that's the actual reason.
Well, according to the carbohydrate insulin model, when you're eating less processed carbohydrates, doesn't mean getting rid of all carbohydrates, but getting rid of these highly processed sugars and starches. Levels of the hormone insulin drop. That helps to redirect calories away from deposit in fat cells and toward the muscle, the organs, and the brain to help support metabolism, to help you feel more satiated, more full after eating, and to help you burn off those calories.
Dr. Ludwig, the reason I'm assuming that you all prepared 160,000 meals during that academic year and provided them to the people in your study was that way they were much less likely to stray from what they were supposed to be eating, because nutrition studies are notoriously difficult. And one of the most difficult parts is getting people to actually eat what they're supposed to and not eat what they're not supposed to. So does it really seem likely that what you found in your study will be translatable into real life?
There are two basic questions that need to be asked in nutrition studies. One is, how do foods affect the body, metabolism, hunger, the expression of our genes? How do those foods affect the body under optimal conditions when you can control everything? The second question is, how do we take that knowledge and develop behavioral interventions and environmental and public health strategies to help people eat in a way that's going to best support their health? The problem is these two questions get conflated. They get mixed up into studies, so obscuring the science. Unfortunately, many of the most diet studies are behavioral, where you tell people, you're going to eat a low-fat diet and you're going to eat a high-fat diet or a high-protein diet, and here's some recipes and meal plans. We'll meet as a group with a dietitian 3 or 4 times over the next 6 months. Now go out and do it.
Actually, I'm going to disagree with you, Dr. Ludwig. I think most of these studies are epidemiological in nature. And so some researcher says, well, what are the people in northern China eating? Yes, they're eating rice. That tells the story. And somebody else does, well, I'm going to study the people in Italy and look at the Mediterranean diet. And they're not even controlled. They're just sort of, we make assumptions about what they're eating and then draw conclusions, which may be completely inappropriate.
Yeah, well, there's certainly problems with epidemiological studies, and they can be misinterpreted. There's a range of quality, but that doesn't mean all epidemiological or observational studies are misleading. Many are critical, and there's some questions we can never ask with a clinical trial. But there's this notion that just because it's a clinical trial means it's high-quality data, and that's not the case. In most dietary behavioral trials, where you put people, even if you randomize them on different diets, the level of support, the intensity of support is low, so that people don't maintain differences in their ways they're eating. How do we know that? Well, you can look at biomarkers, things that we know should change in the blood if people are eating one way or the other. And more often than not, these biomarkers show virtually no difference between the diets. So out of these studies, people conclude that diet doesn't matter and it's all about compliance, but that's a false conclusion. What we have to conclude from these studies is we need more intensive interventions. Think of doing a study with a new cancer drug. Let's say you came up with a potentially remarkable cure for childhood leukemia, and you put one group of kids, you assigned one group of kids to consume this drug and another group to consume a placebo. But it turns out they never took the drug. Maybe it was too expensive to afford, or maybe the parents couldn't find a pharmacy that provided it, or maybe there were minor side effects that could have been worked with. Would you conclude that the drug didn't work? No, you'd say we need a better study before we dismiss that drug. Unfortunately, that basic logical principle doesn't apply to most diet research.
How did your research work? Did people follow it for the most part? And did your biomarkers reinforce that idea?
So in our study, we didn't use a behavioral approach. We did a feeding study where we actually produced and provided meals for all of our participants, basically for a full academic year. It was based on a college campus, Framingham State University in Massachusetts. And because we were providing foods, observing at least one meal a day for most people, and making it really easy for them to eat this way, we could confidently obtain much higher levels of compliance. And our biomarkers, we looked at multiple ones, demonstrated that. Very substantial and sustained discrimination between the groups, which lets us know that they were actually eating very differently. And that provides a basis for making more informative conclusions about how diet affects biology. The next step is to figure out, are these findings real? Can they be replicated? And if so, how can we apply them to a real-world setting? But we don't want to jump to that translation too quickly. That was the mistake made in the 1970s and 80s with the low-fat diet. We jumped to trying to get the population to change their ways of eating without understanding how that new way of eating would actually affect our biology.
You're listening to Dr. David Ludwig. He's a pediatric endocrinologist and a professor of nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig is professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and director of the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center. His books include Ending the Food Fight, Always Hungry, and Always Delicious.
Terry, this kind of study is unusual. Number one, that they controlled for the food intake so carefully, morning, noon, and night. They had large number of people involved, and it was a long-term study, months.
Well, in fact, the fact that they prepared 160,000 meals for those participants during the study, that's pretty impressive.
After the break, we'll find out what seems to work to help people lose weight.
Sometimes exercise makes people super hungry. What's going on and how can you manage this effect?
Would it make sense to reduce easy access to processed carbohydrates through pricing or taxes?
How does a low-carb diet change our biomarkers, and how should we interpret those changes?
And which biomarkers might be most helpful in detecting and preventing diabetes and heart disease?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. To purchase a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1149. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store, and we invite you to consider writing a review.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from hypoallergenic organic ingredients. KAYA Biotics.com.
The diet wars have been raging for years. Each side has ardent proponents, those who insist that a low-fat diet is the best way to control weight, and those who are convinced that a low-carb diet is better have had a hard time finding common ground.
For far too long, the nutrition arena has been dominated by such preconceived ideas. Large-scale surveys don't always provide the details we need to understand how nutrition works at a metabolic level. The carbohydrate insulin hypothesis was recently tested in a rigorous trial conducted by our guest.
We're talking with Dr. David Ludwig. He is co-director of the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center at Boston Children's Hospital. He's also a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and a professor of nutrition at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig has written 3 books for the public: Ending the Food Fight, Always Hungry, and the cookbook Always Delicious.
Dr. Ludwig, we understand you have some exciting future research in mind. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Sure. Well, our most recent study, which we called FS2, Framingham State University study, looked at what happens when you keep body weight the same, what happens to metabolism. And we saw that metabolism speeds up by about 200 to 250 calories a day on a lower carbohydrate diet, about 20% carbohydrate. But the next question to ask is, what happens when you lock calories on these different diets? What happens to body weight and, most importantly, body fat? And that's the purpose of our next study. And in fact, we're taking it to the next level of rigor. In our last study, we prepared foods for people and observed meals being consumed, but they were free living, and some degree of noncompliance is inevitable. So to look at changes in body weight or body fat, we've got to make sure that everyone is eating exactly the same number of calories. This is the ultimate test of whether all calories are alike. And so to do this, we are presently recruiting 125 people who will first lose, on average, about 15% of their weight on a low-calorie, low-carbohydrate diet. We'll stabilize them and then stabilize their weight. And then at that new lower weight, they'll take up residency at a beautiful lakefront retreat center in the woods, very isolated.
So you can't get to the
long
local
ways away from
food.
any it's a long way away from fast food, chips, crackers, soda. And so we'll be able to maintain 24/7 oversight of our participants, giving them every meal that they're observing, every meal that they're consuming, closely monitoring their metabolism, and then doing elaborate studies of their body composition and other relevant biological outcomes. So that study's ongoing. We welcome anybody in the greater New England area to apply. It's called the FB4 study, and you can find us at Boston Children's Hospital. So this study is really our next step. But we also need other studies by independent groups to ask these questions in different ways.
Dr. Ludwig, the last time we talked to you, you had just published Always Hungry. And that book has a number of stories in it about people who have come to you for help. Would you mind sharing a couple of stories about how people approach weight loss and what seems to work and what doesn't seem to work?
Right. So we're we're making a transition from science, which is meticulously controlled, to anecdotes. And anecdotes are important.
Yes.
They really show us, and there's a long history of case stories and case studies in medicine, but it's important to note that anecdotes are just individual experiences, and they don't necessarily apply to everybody. But with that said, I'm happy to summarize some common stories that we've heard, both in the pilot project leading up to our book, but also in our Facebook group. We have a free and non-commercial Facebook group called the Official Always Hungry Book Community. We welcome your listeners to join. And so very frequently we hear that when people give up processed carbohydrates, the phase 1 of our 3-phase program brings carbohydrates down to 25%. So you can still have whole fruits, plenty of vegetables and legumes and other sources of carbohydrate, but it'll, at least for 2 weeks, completely eliminates the processed grains, sugar, potato products. A very common anecdote is that before people have seen any weight loss, they suddenly experience a shift in their control around food. In other words, they go to a party and the cookies, the cake, the ice cream are displayed, whereas it used to be a constant battle for them. They have to almost walk out of the room so as not to be tempted. Somehow those foods very quickly lose their power over people. People are able to take a bite and say, all right, that's nice. Or they might even say, wow, that's just too sweet. I don't like it anymore. But they're now more in control. And then once that shift has happened, that's a very good sign that the weight will come soon.
One of the things that is sort of, we'll say, semi-personal is we know an individual who exercises really vigorously. And sometimes at the end of that exercise experience, there's this ravenous hunger. Feed me now, or I will kill you kind of situation. I'm wondering what's happening metabolically after somebody has maybe run 10 or 15 miles and then has this incredible hunger that requires immediate gratification.
That question goes to the heart of why it is so difficult to lose weight and what our current paradigm of calories in, calories out, all calories are like, might be missing. We know that simply cutting back on calories, a low-calorie diet should produce weight loss, but it's so hard to follow. And that's not just poor willpower. People who try to lose weight are very disciplined, but somehow they get overwhelmed with hunger. And the same is true with physical activity. Time and again, analyses of exercise studies show that it's certainly a good thing for health. You might improve your cholesterol or lower some other cardiovascular disease risk factors. But exercise is a really poor way to cause weight loss in any reasonable time frame, over months or even a few years. And that, again, has to do with the same problem, that the body fights back against efforts to change weight. That when you eat less, your body says, I need more calories. And when you try to burn off calories without changing your metabolism through exercise, the same thing happens. You finish the exercise, you've burned off a lot of calories, but your body is screaming at you. What we need to do is figure out what is going on metabolically that's driving weight up year after year after year, making the average person weigh 25 to 35 pounds more than 40 years ago. And if the problem is hormonal, if the problem is too much insulin caused by all of the processed carbohydrates in our diet, then just cutting back calories while continuing to eat all those processed carbohydrates, trying to force calories out of the body with exercise is setting up a battle between mind and metabolism we're doomed to lose.
So it sounds as though your recommendation, essentially as a policy, would be to reduce the amount of processed carbohydrates that we all have such easy access to.
Many of the policy recommendations that would naturally flow from this way of thinking are already being incorporated. We all now recognize that the de-emphasis on sugar, that the focus on just getting rid of all fats. Remember, at the top of the food guide pyramid, put all fats, nuts, avocado, olive oil, dark chocolate, some of the foods that we know are exceedingly healthy and don't promote weight gain per se. They were all put at the top, and a whole host of processed carbohydrates, 6 to 11 servings, were placed at the bottom. Sugar was identified only as a concern for special populations, specifically children at risk for getting cavities. So we all now recognize that obsession with fat and the pass that was given processed carbohydrates was a mistake. And we need to be cutting back on sugars, processed grains, too much potato products. Where this carbohydrate insulin model, this way of thinking about obesity, would take it to the next step is that we want to bring the total amount of carbohydrates down a bit. Doesn't mean getting rid of all of them. In fact, you could still have plenty of whole fruits, vegetables, certain kinds of root vegetables, and some minimally processed grains, the kinds of grains that we would have consumed generations back, things like steel-cut oats, barley, teff, quinoa. These are slower digesting. So you can still have some of those, but we want to emphasize the healthy fats, olive oil, nuts, nut butters, full-fat dairy. There's really no advantage of fat-free milk over whole milk. And then get enough protein, and that this will be a more sustainable way for most people to maintain a healthy weight over the long term.
Dr. Ludwig, in the old way of thinking, fat was blamed for not just obesity, but diabetes and heart disease and possibly even cancer. That has, to a larger extent, been discredited. I'm wondering, in your study, in which, for example, the low-carbohydrate group, who were getting 20% of their calories from carbohydrates, 60% of their calories from fat, and 20%, if I'm not mistaken, from protein, how did their biomarkers respond? Is that kind of diet, the so-called low-carb diet in your group, did they have better biomarkers when it comes to things like diabetes and heart disease?
We just published the initial results of the study, and we're still in the process of examining a whole range of diabetes and heart disease risk factors. But included with that first study were HDL cholesterol and triglycerides. We included them as compliance markers. We know that triglycerides and HDL change in predictable ways with increasing and decreasing carbohydrate. We saw that. That was evidence that people were complying. And to answer your question, those two, now we didn't look at everything. We haven't yet looked at LDL cholesterol and such, but those two improved markedly on the low carbohydrate diet. Triglycerides decreased and HDL increased, and those are key risk factors that relate to insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome.
And that's a good thing to have HDL higher and triglycerides lower.
Absolutely. In fact, the ratio of triglycerides to HDL cholesterol is a key marker for metabolic health, how sensitive you are to insulin, how likely you are or are not to get diabetes and heart disease. And this ratio looked best on the low carbohydrate diet, but I hasten to add we haven't looked at a whole range of other cardiovascular disease risk factors yet. But let me just say that there is an extensive body of research on fat intake and diabetes and heart disease. We know that some of the highest calorie, highest fat foods around, nuts, olive oil, avocado, real dark chocolate, that despite their maximum calorie density, they look great for long-term diabetes and heart disease risk. Compare those to the processed grains, added sugar, or potato products, which characteristically top the list for weight gain and chronic disease.
So, Dr. Ludwig, in the very short time we have left, what should our listeners take away from the scientific findings of your study?
Well, the scientific findings are going to need to be replicated, so we can't make specific recommendations from this one study. But my view of, based on the strength of the literature in support of the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, is that we want to focused on reducing the processed carbohydrates that invaded our diet during the low-fat years. So much less processed grains, potato products, and added sugar. You can still have plenty of whole fruits, especially the non-tropical fruits, not so much banana, but whole fruits, non-starchy vegetables, some root vegetables, beans, small amounts of minimally processed grains, maybe a touch of added sugar, but to really emphasize the healthy fats, the ones we talked about. There's absolutely no reason to be consuming fat-free rather than full-fat dressing. In fact, olive oil would be, one of the most healthy things we can add to a meal. Avocado, nuts, dairy. If you're eating dairy, make it full-fat. It's tastier. It's more satisfying. And then we want to get an adequate amount of protein, but that doesn't tell us what the source is. Proteins can come from animal or vegetable products. One can eat a low-fat diet with plenty of animal products like turkey breast and egg whites and low-fat dairy, or one can eat a high-fat diet with plenty of plant products, such as the healthy fats that we discussed.
Dr. David Ludwig, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
A pleasure to be back again with you.
You've been listening to Dr. David Ludwig. He's co-director of the New Balance Foundation Obesity Prevention Center at Boston Children's Hospital. He's also a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and a professor of nutrition at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Ludwig has written 3 books for the public: Ending the Food Fight, Always Hungry, and the cookbook, Always Delicious.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from hypoallergenic organic ingredients. That's Kaya Biotics.com.
If you'd like to buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1149. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can place the order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can share your thoughts about our conversation with Dr. David Ludwig. Have you found success with a particular approach to weight loss? Tell us about it in the comments section for today's show. At the website, you'll also find links to the publications we discussed today in the BMJ, in Science, and in JAMA Internal Medicine. There's also a link to an article Dr. Ludwig wrote for the LA Times titled, The Case Against Carbohydrates Gets Stronger.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter or subscribe to the free podcast of the show. When you sign up for the newsletter, you get our free e-guide to favorite home remedies.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.